What's up, everybody? So today we're going to start a kind of a series where we're going to be talking about kratom addiction and trauma. This is something that has been on my mind for a while, and it's something that I personally experienced. And through different connections with you guys, I have found out that a lot of you all have experienced this too. So I hope that as we explore this topic together, that we can all gain some insight on what it is to experience kratom addiction, trauma, PTSD symptoms, triggers, and we can together look at different ways to move through this in a healthy way. So I'll share a little bit about my experience in this video, and then as we move forward, in the videos to come, we can discuss like different things that I've learned and that I've gained during this process of coming to terms not only with the trauma that I've experienced, but different ways that I have healed from it and moved forward from it. And we're also going to look at how kratom addiction plays into this process. Okay, so first off, I'll share a little bit about my experience. And I just want to let you guys know, like, this is a topic it's not easy to talk about, trauma and like things that have happened to us. It's gnarly, it's rough. And so I just want to let you know that, and I appreciate your patience and your understanding and all of that as we move forward in these videos together. So, I've come from a very hard family life. I was raised in a home with a mom with mental illness and addiction and different unhealthy behaviors, and a dad who was working really hard and really wasn't like emotionally present or there, even physically. And so my parents got divorced when I was 8 years old. And throughout my childhood, I experienced a lot of physical abuse, emotional abuse, being parentified by my mom, meaning being put into the role of being a parent through being one who would listen to her about her different struggles that she was going through and counsel her, as well as like the physical aspect of that, which is taking care of the home, taking care of my younger siblings. And so that was a part of what was going on. There was a lot of emotional abuse too, as my mom's addictions and different unhealthy behaviors really amplified during my young childhood. There was a lot of physical violence, and past the point of just like, like normal spankings, there were broken bones, there were outrages that would happen because of different moods that she would be in, where there would be violence that would happen from it. And I'm not going to get into obviously specifics because that's not super relevant, but just painting a general picture of like what that was like. I moved in with my dad when I was 11. My parents got divorced when I was 8, like I said. And I moved in with my dad and my stepmom, who I didn't really know that well at that point. But there came a point in the abuse that I was experiencing at my mom's house that I knew that I had to leave and I had to survive, basically. Like my survival instinct, which has always been very strong in me, kicked in. I forgot to mention too that my mom had met and remarried, who then became my stepdad, who very, very quickly after my parents divorced, and he was an active alcoholic. And he wasn't physically abusive in any way, but bringing that aspect of alcoholism into the home was a factor too, and it led to different things like poverty type conditions and very unclean conditions, with lots of animals that couldn't be taken care of. And so there, things just got really bad. And so my survival instincts, like I said, kicked in, and I moved in with my dad when I was 11 years old. I wish that that's when it got better, but unfortunately it didn't. And although the physical and emotional abuse and the conditions of the home improved, there was just a lot of challenges being able to get along and relate with my stepmom at the time, who was very structured and who was very organized. And coming from the chaos of my mom's house, I had a really hard time adjusting to that. And I was going through puberty at that time too, which didn't make it any easier. And things just started to kind of like compile with me not being able to adjust to the home, struggling in school, and things just became like me and my stepmom weren't really able to even like live under the same roof, and she wanted me to go elsewhere. So I moved in with my grandparents on my mom's side first. And my grandmother unfortunately ended up passing away of cancer a year after I moved in with them. And so I then moved in with my grandparents on my dad's side for about a year or so as well. And at this point, I'm in high school. I had to switch high schools. And that's when I ended up meeting the first person who kind of introduced me to the whole hippie scene. It was a girl in my art class that I connected with because in this high school that I had switched to from the normal school like high school and like, what do you call it, school zone that I had grown up in, living in the same area with my mom and then my dad and my stepmom. I moved to a whole other school district, that's the right word for it, with my grandparents. And so this high school had the coolest art teachers and the coolest art department. And I would skip all of my classes in this new high school that I was at and go to the art room, because it was just kind of like a safe haven for me. And music, as you know, has always been a big part of my life, but art has as well. And it's always been like coping mechanisms for me to kind of deal with the different struggles with my family life and all the stuff that I had been through. So I met this girl in my art class who was into like the Grateful Dead and Fish and all of that. And she was so cool. And that was like my first like, time that I had experienced this music. And that summer of that year, in between my sophomore year of high school and my junior year of high school, we snuck out to a Fish show, and actually a few Fish shows. And after that, my whole life and my whole world changed. And I knew that after going to these Fish shows, that there was a place that I could go and be, and not only be accepted, and like I had fallen in love with this music. Like it was just so cool to me, but like I had a place where like I didn't need to, be in somebody else's, home in my family, because at this point there was nowhere else I could go. And so after I was, shown this whole other life of like these concerts, and, during that time, people would travel around following these concerts, like similarly to the Grateful Dead, which I was right after Jerry Garcia's passing when I started getting into this by like 3 years. So I just had missed Jerry Garcia and the actual true Grateful Dead. But when I found like Fish and Fish Tour, it gave me an escape from everything that I was raised in. And so my grandparents that I was living with, after we got caught sneaking out to those concerts, So after that, and like, that's when I had started getting into smoking weed and all of this stuff, and, had gotten caught doing that. So they were like, okay, we're done. We can't handle her anymore. And going back to my dad and my stepmom's house, like it just wasn't going to work. So I ended up leaving home. I had just turned 16 years old. And I left in the fall of that year, which would be 1999. I made it 2 weeks into my junior year before I left high school. And so I did fall tour of 99 with Fish, and then I ended up going on and following Further, which was kind of the rest of the members of the Grateful Dead, and Phil and Friends, which was the bassist of the Grateful Dead. And I ended up doing all of that, as well as like music festivals. And so then my life went on from there. And I'm giving you kind of like a storyline of this so you can follow like where I came from and then where my life went. So I ended up meeting my son's father, at a music festival when I was 17 and he was 18 years old. And we dated and traveled, and then we settled down in Durango, Colorado, and I ended up becoming pregnant with my son a few years later. So we got married when I was pregnant with my son, and I had my son Gabriel in the fall of 2003. And so I share this with you because, as you can see, like my life as I leave home, and I started doing tour and traveling and all of that kind of stuff. Lived in Northern California before I ended up meeting my son's dad. So I had been all these different places, and I really just ran away from everything that I had experienced in my life, and like, this environment of the hippie scene and these concerts and traveling, and then also then meeting my son's dad and then starting my own family. Like it all was a way of not having to ever think about what I had been through. And so all of that abuse and trauma and neglect, and I just kind of painted a vague picture about everything that I had been through when I was young, but there were very specific things that happened to me that just kind of got buried. And I didn't deal with it because I didn't have to deal with it. Life took off, and I was living it, and it was great. Like when I went to those concerts and I lived that life, I didn't have to think about any of that. And I didn't have to go back and live in it. And, having my own family and having my own child, like, I didn't have to deal with any of the stuff that I went through. So as I got older, things started to kind of, creep up and like present themselves, as far as like there were things that weren't right about me, in the sense of that, like I would get triggered by different things. The relationship with my son's dad was very unhealthy. At best, it was toxic. He was a drug addict, and there was a lot of verbal and emotional abuse. And when you're with an addict, there is the very unsettled, very insecure foundation that's laid, where there's no trust. And he would disappear for sometimes a week or two on end on drug binges. And so there was a lot of insecurity in that relationship that started to trigger things in me from what I had been through. And it started to kind of come up as just very... There's psychological terms that I don't remember right now, but basically where I would become very insecure and triggered, in the sense of like, the neglect that I had been through when I was younger. And I found myself in a place of constant fear and anxiety and panic attacks. And I wasn't able to sleep for months and months on end. And it was basically like this feeling of like being afraid that the bottom was going to drop out and the crap was going to hit the ceiling all at the same time. And it ended up where I just, was constantly like afraid. And my son's dad and I fought all the time. And so as things moved forward in my life, and my son's dad and I separated and then eventually divorced, there became this upheaval of these this like past, like, stuff of neglect and abuse and trauma that I had been through before. And throughout all of these changes, there was really no secure environment in my life. And that was very triggering as well. So I wasn't ever able to be fully present. And I was living in this space of like, only unable to be fully present, but not able to live my full potential, and being in this state of just like holding on by a thread at any moment, at any moment, like things were just gonna, my home environment and like any sort of stability was gonna completely dissolve, which was also, a reflection of how I was raised. And so things moved forward, and I ended up through the separation and divorce with my son's dad and ex-husband. I started to self-medicate a lot with alcohol and weed, and I never was physically addicted to alcohol, but I was using it to cope with everything that I had been through. And by the grace of God, I ended up quitting drinking when I was 26 years old, which will be 14 years this June, coming up next month, actually. And, but I wasn't completely sober because I was smoking so much weed, and I had gotten caught up in, different like new age healing stuff, like, alternative, like healing methods, and like, got caught up in trying psychedelics and all this stuff, because at this point, like, I'm getting into my late 20s, early 30s, and, I have not made sense of anything that's happened to me in my life. And as you know, if you've ever heard a little bit of my testimony, I've loved God and I've loved Jesus since I was a small child, and it was a big part of me being able to live through a lot of the stuff that I had been through as a kid. But I turned away from God when my son's dad and I separated. I looked at it like, if God could allow that to happen, then I didn't want anything to do with him. So as things progressed, I got really caught up in the new age, and I began to go into these, alternative healing, attempts to try to heal from what I had been through. Because I knew, you guys, like, I knew that the stuff that had happened to me when I was young was not cool. I knew that there were things about me that were not okay, and that the way that my emotions were and the way that I would respond to different situations was not okay. And so it was my attempt at trying to heal. But it, as you know, I know a lot of people who I've talked to end up crossing my channel who also got caught up in the new age. Like, as you know, like, these things never really lead us anywhere. These new age spiritual practices and these, different things like psychedelics and like all of that kind of stuff, like, it never leads to true healing. Sure, it may take away like some of the symptoms in the moment, but like, you're never getting to the root issue, which is that trauma that is buried deep down inside of us. So it was then during this time that I was studying herbalism in the new age, and I came across kratom for the first time. And I got into it for a lot of different reasons, but it was in an attempt not only to deal with things that were happening in the present in my life, but as a way to kind of deal with these trauma, PTSD, CPTSD, which is complex trauma, which is where things happen to you over and over again. And it's in a short amount of time, especially, and that's definitely what I had experienced. And so I started taking the kratom partly as a way to kind of deal with this stuff. Because, in my everyday life, there was a lot of, challenges with it, and a lot of challenges with being triggered, and then the reactions that I was, then, having to these triggers. So that's when kratom came into the picture. And I've explained it before that that addictions like weed and like kratom, it's like throwing a wet blanket over things like our trauma and different challenges that we're going through in our life, where like it'll dampen how we're feeling about it, but it's not solving or curing anything. So that's what it was like for me at first before kratom turned on me, where like, sure, I felt great at first when I started taking kratom, and it was a experience where like I was like, okay, I'm good. Like, that's the thing with trauma too, is that like you can't stop living your life. You have to keep living your life. And so you find little ways to kind of deal with it, and that's what it was. So this video is already getting pretty long, and we're going to unpack different ways on how this has unfolded. But basically, like, the longer I stayed in my kratom addiction, I had what they refer to, excuse me, as a healing crisis, where everything that I had experienced came to a head, and it was like a reckoning of sorts, where like I had to not only face, but like actually process and integrate and come to terms with everything that had happened to me. But the kratom addiction was, it was a season of time where like I had this like complete like unraveling, basically, where something about the kratom and the kratom addiction, yeah, there was the wet blanket aspect at first where it made everything better, but towards the end of my addiction, it like brought everything up to the surface, and it made it so raw and so palpable and so real, and everything that I hadn't dealt with came up to the surface. And at the end of my kratom addiction, and then through my quitting and recovery process, was when that wet blanket was finally taken off. And I had to look at what had happened to me without any way of numbing it. And I had to first feel everything, and then grieve it, and then accept it, and then integrate all of it into who I am now, because we can never change what has happened to us, but we can integrate it into who we are now, and then become stronger and better people from what we've learned. So like, that's where this kind of little mini series, if you will, is going, is that, it was definitely a process for me. And I share my story with you, and it isn't easy to share this story and to be so real and to be so open with the world, basically, that like, this is what happened to me. And then this is, I guess it's cool because this is where I am now, but we're going to get into that. We're going to get into, what subsequently happened after it. And the kratom addiction, played a huge part in all of this. So, and the recovery from it, obviously emphasized that, played the biggest part in it. So who sits before you today is a whole, grounded, person who has joy and freedom despite the trauma that I've been through. So I look forward to getting into this with you together, and I look forward to seeing hopefully some of you experience that as well. So I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.